The 1904 Olympics marathon was a total mess. The first place finisher did most of the race in a car, the guy in second almost died from eating rat poison, and the fourth place finisher raced in dress pants and shoes, and took a nap by the side of the road for part of the race. The first to arrive at the finish line, after 3 hours and 13 minutes, was Fred Lurs. After being hailed as the winner, he had his photograph taken with Alice Roosevelt, daughter of then U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, and was about to be awarded the gold medal when his subterfuge was revealed. Lurs, suffering cramps, had actually dropped out of the race after 9 miles, and hitched a ride back to the stadium in a car, waving at spectators and runners alike during the ride. When the car broke down at the 19th mile, he re-entered the race and jogged across the finish line. Upon being confronted by officials, Lurs immediately admitted his deception, and despite his claim that he was joking, the AAU responded by banning him for life. This was later reduced to a year after it was found that he had not intended to defraud. Lurs would later win the 1905 Boston Marathon. Thomas Hicks ended up the winner of the event, although he was aided by measures that would not have been permitted in later years. 10 miles from the finish, Hicks led the race by 1.5 miles, but he had to be restrained from stopping and lying down by his trainers. From then until the end of the race, Hicks received several doses of strychnine, a common rat poison, which stimulates the nervous system in small doses, mixed with brandy and an egg white. He continued to battle onwards, hallucinating, barely able to walk for most of the course. When he reached the stadium, his support team carried him over the line, holding him in the air while he shuffled his feet as if still running. Hicks had to be carried off the track, and might have died in the stadium had he not been treated by several doctors. He lost 8 pounds during the course of the marathon. Another near fatality during the event was William Garcia of the United States. He was found lying in the road, along the marathon course with severe internal injuries, caused by breathing the clouds of dust, kicked up by the race officials' cars. Cuban postman Andrén Carvajal had also joined the marathon, arriving at the last minute. After losing all of his money gambling in New Orleans, Louisiana, he hitchhiked to St. Louis, and had to run the event in street clothes, that he cut around the legs to make them look like shorts. Not having eaten in 40 hours, he saw a spectator eating 2 peaches. He asked if he could have the peaches, and the spectator declined. He then stole both peaches and ran away. Later, he stopped off in an orchard, to eat some apples, which turned out to be rotten. The rotten apples caused him to have strong stomach cramps, and he had to lie down and take a nap. Despite falling ill from the apples, and taking a nap, he still managed to finish in 4th place. During the race, John Lorden, who had won the 1903 Boston Marathon, was violently ill after 10 miles and retired, while Sam Mellor, who had won the 1902 Boston Marathon, was also overcome by the dust. Despite leading the field at the halfway mark, Mellor dropped out of the race after 16 miles. Arriving without correct documents, Albert Corey, a French immigrant to the United States, is inconsistently listed as performing in a mixed team, in the 4-mile team race, with 4 undisputed Americans, and performing for the U.S. in the marathon. The South African entrants, Lynn Taniane, and Jan Masciani, finished 9th and 12th, respectively. This was a disappointment, as many observers were sure Tao could have done better, if he had not been chased nearly a mile off course by wild dogs. Violet Jessop, often referred to as the Queen of Sinking Ships or Miss Unsinkable, was an Argentine woman of Irish heritage, who worked as an ocean liner stewardess, memoirist, and nurse in the early 20th century. Jessup is most well known for having survived the sinking of both the RMS Titanic in 1912, and her sister ship the HMHS Britannic in 1916, as well as having been on board the eldest of the 3 sister ships, the RMS Olympic, when it collided with the British warship, HMS Hawke in 1911. Wife selling in England was a way of ending an unsatisfactory marriage that probably began in the late 17th century, when divorce was a practical impossibility for all but the very wealthiest. After parading his wife with a halter around her neck, arm, or waist, a husband would publicly auction her to the highest bidder. Although the custom had no basis in law, and frequently resulted in prosecution, particularly from the mid-19th century onwards, the attitude of the authorities was equivocal. At least one early 19th century magistrate is on record as stating that he did not believe he had the right to prevent wife sales, and there were cases of local poor law commissioners forcing husbands to sell their wives, rather than having to maintain the family in workhouses. Wife selling persisted in England, in some form until the early 20th century, according to the jurist and historian James Bryce, writing in 1901, wife sales were still occasionally taking place during his time. In one of the last reported instances of a wife sale in England, a woman giving evidence in a Leeds police court, in 1913 claimed that she had been sold to one of her husband's workmates for £1. Robert Liston was a British surgeon. Liston was noted for his speed and skill in an era prior to anesthetics, when speed made a difference in terms of pain and survival. He also performed the only known surgery in history, with a 300% mortality rate. Gordon describes what he calls Liston's most famous case. Liston got to work, he amputated the leg in under 2.5 minutes, the patient died afterwards, in the ward, from hospital gangrene, they usually did, in those pre-Listerian days. He amputated in addition, the fingers of his young assistant, who died afterwards, from hospital gangrene. And finally, he slashed through the coat-tails of a distinguished surgical spectator, who was so terrified, that the knife had pierced his vitals, fainted from fright, and was later discovered to have died from shock. Thus, 3 people died during an operation that was meant to save one life. In the era of Prohibition, between the years of 1920 to 1933, thousands died in what was known as self-induced methanol poisonings, as consumers threw caution to the wind, and imbibed whatever they could find. Often leaving its victims permanently blind, when not killing them outright. Methanol was cheaper and much easier to come by than the more tightly regulated ethanol, and was mixed into much of what unscrupulous bootleggers were smuggling into the speakeasies of New York. But as author Deborah Bloom points out, the bootleggers were but partly to blame. In 1926, the federal government, in an effort to enforce the so-called Noble Experiment, mandated adding poisons, including methanol, to industrial alcohol so as to discourage people from drinking it. Unfortunately, instead of leading to decreased consumption, this only resulted in more death and suffering, with a toll from that year's Christmas celebrations reaching 23 dead, and dozens more blinded in New York City alone. Distraught at the horror he was witnessing, Norris issued a public statement on December 28, 1926, stating that the government knows it is not stopping drinking by putting poison in alcohol. It knows what the bootleggers are doing with it, and yet it continues its poisoning process, heedless of the fact that people determined to drink are daily absorbing that poison. Knowing this to be true, the United States government must be charged with the moral responsibility for the deaths that poison liquor causes. Despite public outcry and the rising death toll from poisoned alcohol, estimated to be approximately 10,000, this policy continued until Prohibition was repealed 7 years later.